We're glad you're here. We're working our way through a series of studies in Bible backgrounds we started last week, and this is going to be about the culture, the geography, the people groups, the timelines of the Bible, and it will take us through September, so we've got a couple months to go. And Lord willing, by the time we're done with this, we have some better insights into things in the Bible that are hard for us as Westerners to understand. So the culture of the Bible is ancient, and it's in a different part of the world, and most of the events are from long, long ago, and so it's a little hard for us to get a grip on sometimes. So this series is designed to give us some background, some material that stands behind the scriptures as far as customs, culture, people, times, geography, and this morning is intended to be kind of a big picture sweep from Genesis through the epistles of the New Testament, mostly looking at time periods and just trying to get a grip on what is happening in parts of the Bible. So it's not comprehensive. That'd be very difficult to do in a short period of time, but it is intended to be kind of a big picture, bird's eye view of the time of the Bible. So let's get started. So here are some dates, and you may or may not have an affinity for dates. Maybe you love dates, maybe you hate them, but dates are something you can hang your hat on, and some good dates, actually just sort of some rough numbers that can be useful would be when we pick up the book of Genesis and we jump into, say, chapter 12, a date that should run around in your head is 2000 BC. So you can see for Abraham, right here, his official date, the date that we're relatively confident, pretty close, pretty tight. It's been studied exhaustively, these dates and the chronologies. So we're pretty confident that that's a good date for the birth of Abraham. But if you want a general ballpark kind of a figure, 2000 BC for Abraham. And then if you jump forward about 500 years, here's another ballpark number, 1500 before the time of Christ. That would be Moses. So 2000 Abraham, 1500 Moses. Jump forward another 500, 1000 BC, David. So again, these are ballpark numbers. You can see more exact ones on the screen. And then if you go forward about another 500 years or so, 586 is the exact date for the fall of Jerusalem and the Babylonian exile. So chunks of 500, 2000 BC, Abraham, 1500 Moses, 1000 David, and about 500 or so Babylonian exile. So those are some, and then 500 years more, and at the time of Christ. So those chunks of 500 are useful pegs to hang your hat on as you're looking at biblical material. But these are more exact dates behind me on the screen. Again, we can have pretty good confidence. They have been verified by studying very, very carefully and exhaustively the biblical content, the material of the Bible itself, and then where possible corroborating that with extra biblical sources. So pretty good, pretty accurate. Maybe some of the older ones are off by a couple of years, but these would be pretty good. So Abraham 2166 BC, Moses about 1500. The Exodus, that is the leading of the children of Israel out of Egypt, 1445. How long were they in the wilderness? 40 years. And so their entrance is 1405 BC. And then, a while later, this would go past the time of the judges, past the time of King Saul. David is around 1000 BC. There's more exact dates that we can use. 1009 is probably the exact date for the beginning of his reign in Hebron. Solomon's temple built 940 BC. Destruction of the northern kingdom by the Assyrians, 721 BC. And that was the near annihilation of most of the north of Israel. The city of Samaria destroyed, and several tribes of Israel, not quite exterminated, but thousands killed and tens of thousands or perhaps hundreds of thousands scattered. That was the foreign policy of the Assyrian Empire. Scatter subjugated peoples so they won't have the opportunity to mount a rebellion. So how many tribes were there in the northern kingdom? 10. 10 tribes. What were the 2 tribes in the southern kingdom? One is Judah and one is Benjamin. Judah and Benjamin were the 2 tribes in the southern kingdom. The 10 northern tribes are scattered, and you'll sometimes hear or read about the 10 lost tribes. They're not necessarily lost as in we're not quite sure what happened. For a lot of people, as in hundreds of thousands of Jews, we really don't know where they went or where they landed. We do know some, and intriguingly, in the last 15 or 20 years, more has been found about where they landed. And it is astounding. This is due to both cultural research and genetic testing. Jews have been found in western China, in Burma, Myanmar, in Spain and Portugal, and in other places around Europe and the Middle East, and even in the Far East, India. There are Jews in India, and they probably are there from 721 BC. So 2,700 years ago, the northern kingdom was annihilated, and thousands of people were told by their conquerors, the Assyrians, whatever you can carry, take it with you, and you're leaving right now. And they were scattered all across the Assyrian Empire. The destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC by the Babylonians, a very famous king. What was the name of the king of Babylon? Nebuchadnezzar. The second. Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon was the king at that time. Birth of Christ, you've got a range there between 5 and 2 BC, because it's actually challenging to figure out. Now, we do have information. The Bible does give us information about when. So what are some of the parameters? What are some of the points that we can use to try to figure out a more exact date? The census. So Caesar Augustus ordered a census. When was that? Okay, well, what else? It was while Quirinius was governor of Syria. So the governors, if we had records about that, okay, what else? There's a star that appeared around the time of his conception and birth, and so, there are things we can use. Even with those pieces of information, it is still a little bit challenging. I've read quite a bit on it, and I'm still not convinced entirely, okay, it's got to be this year right here. Somewhere between 5 BC and 2 BC is about the range. Traditional dating would be like 0 or 1, either BC or AD. So death of Christ between 28 and 33. The first book of the New Testament, possibly James. We can't be 100% sure on that either. Other contenders would be the Gospel of Mark or the book of Galatians. But James may be the first New Testament letter written around 45 AD. And Revelation, the last book of the New Testament, written between 90 and 100 AD. So there's a basic timeline. So now let's go back to the beginning and start in our minds. So the first chapters of Genesis, and this is referenced elsewhere in the Bible, but the book of Genesis tells us a relatively complete narrative of creation of the flood. So chapters 1 through 9, Eden, the Garden of Eden was a real geographical location. It was a real place. It's not mythological. And God created the whole world, all the animals, everything, created 2 human beings, put them in the garden, and we don't know where that garden was. Somewhere in the Fertile Crescent, we think, maybe towards the northern arc of it, or maybe over towards the Persian Gulf. Somewhere Mesopotamia, Tigris and Euphrates rivers, we're not 100% sure. The world did change after the flood. And so difficult to pin down even if we had more exact information. So this is the beginning of the world, the beginning of the human race. Genesis is the book of beginnings. So you've got the beginning of the world, beginning of the human race, the beginning of all creation, the beginning of the Jewish people, the beginning of God's relationship with men. It's the book of beginnings. It records the fall of Adam and Eve and of the human race. And that was an actual historical event that actually occurred. It's not just myth or legend. There was a tree, it was a physical tree, that they were not supposed to eat the fruit of it, and they did. And so that was the beginning of sin, and sin impacted immediately and long-term the entire human race. And that's where we're at now. So there's the decline in human longevity. No doubt you've read the early chapters of Genesis and been amazed at so-and-so lived to be 700 some years old, and he had sons and daughters, and he died. And so-and-so lived to be 600 something. Thinking, wow. I just read an article a couple weeks ago about a guy who lived to be 109. And that is amazing. Well, you know, at the beginning of the world, somebody who died at 109, it's, oh, that is so sad. He had his whole life in front of him. So things have changed. The decline in human longevity and sin in the human race has impacted every part of us. Every aspect of humanity has been impacted by sin.
That's right. As I read that too, when you talk about people living 6, 7, it wasn't like they were over decrepit. It was like they were functioning, going and doing in their extreme old age.
Do one more thing with it. They apparently had fertility for a long period of time. They were having a lot of kids. So the population of the early earth is not like, okay, well, there's 2, and then 25 years later there's 4, and then 100 years later there's 8 of them. No, it's not like that. It's like this. It's, what's that, geometric or exponential? Exponential, thank you. It's exponential growth. And so the population of the world very early on would have been probably very shocking to us, that we're talking not just thousands and not just hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions. That's entirely plausible, that by the time of the flood is, I can't remember now, 1,200, 1,500 years roughly after the creation, somewhere in that vicinity. By the time of the flood, we're talking about a large population. It's not like, you know, 5 villages and they each have 17 people in them. This is a lot of people. So, sin in the human race. And flood to Tower of Babel, Genesis 9 through 11, God's command, of course, to Noah and his family getting off the ark, spread out on the earth, multiply, have dominion, and man, we're told, rebelled against that direct command by staying in one location. And in that one location, they're going to build a tower. Now, an archaic way of looking at this is, oh, they thought that they were going to become God by climbing up into heaven and you know, taking over the throne room or something like that. That's probably not the case. You probably have seen pictures of Mesopotamian ziggurats. A ziggurat is a step-sided pyramid, and there are many of them. Some of them seem to be extremely ancient. Some of them may go back to the time of Babel. And some of them have a domed room on top. The interior was painted blue, dark blue. It's a dome, and the evidence would support that this was a planetarium. And it was designed for worshiping the stars, worshiping the celestial bodies. So this is the point where man decided, I don't want God leaning over me and making rules for my life. I want to make my own gods. And I'm going to worship the gods that I come up with. And so this is where the worship of the sun, the moon, the stars began, probably. At bare minimum, man is rebelling against God because God had said, I want you to spread out, occupy the earth, have lots of babies, and have dominion over the earth. And man is saying, we're all going to stay here. We're going to stay in one location, and we're going to build a city, and we're going to build a tower, and so on. And so, once again, sin is rising to the fore. So, man's rebellion in the form of staying in one location. The tower is likely a religious center for the worship of the stars and planets, not a means of physically reaching into outer space. God intervenes again and moves families towards various locations. So, we have Shem, Ham, and Japheth, as we're told in the Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10. And that's kind of faint. Pastor Nate, could you turn off the front lights, please? Thank you. So, Ararat is a mountainous region, not a single mountain, it's a mountain chain over here in what today's Turkey and Armenia, over in here. And that's where the ark landed, somewhere in this vicinity. And then the Japhethites, descendants of Japheth, probably settled all around in here and moved over here. The Japhethites are the ancestors of the Europeans. So they're the forerunners of most European peoples. The Hamites moved to Africa. So Egypt and Cush and so on, Ethiopia, those are Hamites. One of Ham's sons is Canaan, and he would appear to be the father of the Canaanites, who, of course, live right in here. And then lastly, Shem is the father of all the Semitic peoples. Shem, Sem. The Semitic peoples are who? Jews and Arabs. Jews and Arabs. And so they settled in Arabia, and Abraham is going to come originally from Ur and go to Haran, and then down to Canaan. Yes?
How about Asia?
So, difficult to say. I've read a little bit on human genome studies, and the Asians are probably related to Europeans, and probably not Semitic, and not too much to Hamites. So the Asians are a variation of Japhethites, probably. So in Genesis, moving from Abraham, about Genesis chapter 12, through Moses, which would be the whole rest of the Pentateuch, the great civilizations at this time are Mesopotamia, Tigris and Euphrates, where Iraq is today, and then over on the western side, Egypt. Two great empires, great civilization, great learning, great scholarship, a lot of scientific studies, huge building programs, armies, music, literature, education. So these are huge civilizations with a lot of accomplishments. And there's often kind of a dynamic tension between them. Egypt in the west, Mesopotamia in the east. So locations that rise up in this time period would be Ur, Haran, Canaan, Egypt, and Sinai. The time period is 2166, that's Abraham, to 1405, that's the entrance into Canaan. And here is Abraham's journey to Canaan. It's actually a long ways. So here's Ur the Chaldees, here's the Persian Gulf, so that you can't make it out on this map. The Tigris and the Euphrates rivers come down here. And he journeyed with his father. What was Abraham's father's name? Terah. Terah led his family. We're not 100% clear. It's possible that Terah had a relationship with Jehovah, that Terah knew God. He left Ur the Chaldees. So he left here and traveled north and west along the Tigris and Euphrates River valleys to Haran, which would be northern Syria or southern Turkey today. How come he intended to go to Canaan, but he stopped halfway? How come he didn't go the short route?
Desert.
That's all desert. Nobody goes that way unless you know where the oases are, unless you have a lot of water with you, because you're going to die. That's the Arabian desert, harsh, hard. This is sand dunes and rocks. And daytime temperatures 120 and nighttime temperatures in the 20s. So this is a difficult place to travel. So that's why most caravans go like this. And that's why it's called the Fertile Crescent, because that's where there's water, there's irrigation, there's rainfall, there's green grass and vegetation, so you stick with the Fertile Crescent. So Terah took his family and moved to Haran, and it was sometime later that God called Abram and said, I want you to leave. So you leave behind everything that's there in Haran, and you follow what I'm telling you to do, and you go to the land I'm going to show you. So he left Haran and traveled down to Canaan. Not too long after getting there, he made a huge mistake and went down to Egypt and got himself into trouble there. But that is the journey of Abraham. So next we move from Moses to David. So this would be the Pentateuch: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And then we move ahead to Joshua, Judges, Ruth. And so the time period from Moses, which is about 1445, the Exodus from Egypt, to David, he begins reigning in 1009 BC, so about 400 years. And we're skipping over the period of the Judges. So the entrance into the land, Joshua, the battles in Canaan against the Canaanites, and then the time period of the Judges, that's all in that parenthesis. That's all in that gap, that 400-year time. And I'm also not really talking about King Saul, David's predecessor. So the period of the Judges, roughly 1375 to 1009, David begins to reign. Remember, he reigned for 7 years in Hebron before he moved to Jerusalem. And so he started ruling in Hebron 1009 BC. He died in 969, having reigned a total of 40 years. And locations that show up in this section would be Egypt, Sinai, Canaan, and then surrounding Canaan. Canaan, Israel is going to become the focal point of most of the rest of the Old Testament. But around Canaan, around Israel, you'd have Moab, Aram, Ammon, Edom, Zobah, Philistia, kingdoms and people groups around Israel. Remember that Joshua was in charge of dividing and distributing the land, the portions of land to the 12 tribes. And here is a map that will show you. Here's the tribes and color-coded to where they are. So this part here is going to become eventually the southern kingdom. That's Judah. Simeon was kind of buried in the middle of it. Judah and Benjamin, largely. And then from the top of the Dead Sea, around in here, north, is going to become the northern kingdom eventually. But there are 12 tribes in that territory, except on the east side of the Jordan, over in here, you do have 2.5 tribes. So anybody remember who they are? Reuben, Manasseh, and Gad. Actually, the half tribe of Manasseh, because they have part inheritance on the west side, part on the east side. And so this is the inheritance lines for the tribes of Israel. There's one tribe, if you take the time to check that out, you'll see 11 apportionments. Why is that again? Because there's 12 tribes. The Levites, they don't have one chunk of land. They have cities scattered throughout the whole nation. And they have a city, they have a little bit of land around the city, but it's not really enough arable land where they can make a go. There's not enough land to support crops and flocks and herds. There's some, but it's not really enough for an entire tribe. What do you do with that? So God had planned that the tribe of Levi was to derive its living primarily from the gifts and sacrifices and offerings that the people of God would bring to the tabernacle or the temple. So that was a good deal of the source of supply for the tribe of Levi.
Did the people, the tribe of Simeon, give up their land when the split happened?
So what happened to Simeon? Because Simeon was originally assigned a different portion than you see here. And eventually they said, it's recorded in the books of Joshua and Judges, they said, we don't really like where we're at. It's difficult. And there's some criticism of the tribe of Simeon because they said, we can't fight against the indigenous peoples that are here, the Canaanites that are here. We're having trouble. And so they asked and got permission to move the entire tribe. And so they're kind of surrounded. It's this green right here. They're surrounded, they're landlocked by Judah. But after that narrative, Joshua and Judges, we don't really hear much more about Simeon. We know they're still there, but we don't really have a record of, well, what happened to them? Are they just kind of absorbed into Judah and Benjamin? Or, what's the deal? So we don't really know what happened to Simeon after that. Good question. Here's the United Kingdom under David. And so David, and again, this is a very faint, on my screen I've got nice colors. Jerusalem is his capital. He started out in Hebron, ruling just the tribe of Judah. And then 7 years later, the entire nation said, we want you to be king of everybody. And he moved his capital from Hebron to Jerusalem. And he rules, in the bigger picture of the Middle East, it's a small territory. But under David and Solomon, they actually do become regional players. They actually do become kind of important in this part of the Middle East. They're not, they never were as big as Egypt or as big as Assyria, or that never happened. But they did become a regional power. And so they are surrounded by other nations. So here's the Ammonites. They're the capital of the country of Jordan. Does anybody know the name of the capital? What is the capital of Jordan? Amman. Amman. And that is directly related to the people who used to live there, the Ammonites. The Ammonites lived at that time. The capital, which is where Amman is today, the capital of that kingdom was called Rabbah. Today it's Amman, named after the Ammonites. So that's Ammon. South of there is Moab, and south of there is Edom. So this is kind of arid, dry. There's some green. They did have herds and flocks there. But Edom is even drier. It's not a real green place at all. A lot of desert, a lot of dry territory. And of course, Egypt is over here. This is called the Negev, the South Country. Anything south of Beersheba is called Negev. Actually, Beersheba is often considered part of the Negev. You'll see a phrase that occurs in the Old Testament several times, from Dan to Beersheba. So here's Dan, and here's Beersheba. And it's used symbolically to represent the whole nation. Everything from Dan to Beersheba. Like we would say from New York to San Francisco. So you're talking about the whole country, and that phrase is used in the Old Testament. So from David, 1009, to the annihilation of the northern kingdom, 721 BC, David and his son Solomon reign over the United Kingdom. Solomon builds the temple. That was a big deal, to have a permanent temple for God. the breakup of Israel into the northern kingdom of Israel, southern kingdom of Judah, the steady erosion of the worship of Yahweh in the northern kingdom. With few exceptions, the northern kingdom just is on a downward trajectory. They go down, and they keep going down, and they go down faster. So the northern kingdom is just in a really bad way, and they get worse. And then there's several kingdoms in the vicinity around Israel that get absorbed by the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire is a very warlike country, and they just kind of swallowed up the entire Middle East. Finally, in 722, 721 BC, the northern kingdom collapsed, and the capital of Samaria was destroyed. 10 tribes are exiled into Assyrian territories. We mentioned that a moment ago. From the northern kingdom, the exile of the northern kingdom to the Babylonian exile, so from 721 BC to 586, and this would encompass the Old Testament books of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. The Neo-Babylonian Empire absorbs the Assyrian Empire, and then the kings in Jerusalem, the southern kingdom, Judah, are a mixed bag. So you have some great ones, Josiah, Jehoshaphat, Hezekiah, Uzziah, and so on, some good kings, largely, but then you have some really, really bad kings too. So they're a mixed bag, and the overall spiritual life of the southern kingdom is also on a downward trajectory. God keeps sending prophets to the kings of the southern kingdom and to the people of the southern kingdom, and many of these prophets warn the people about a specific sin that pops up a lot. What was the sin of the Jews before the exile? Idolatry. They worshiped all these other gods. They saw what the Moabites were doing and what the Edomites were doing, what the Egyptians were doing, and they tended to worship their gods. And God says, I'm tired of this. And I told you, I'm your God, you're my people, and you don't need anything else. But the children of Israel kept going to these other gods over decades, over hundreds of years. Finally, Jerusalem is captured and destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon in 586 BC, and the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed. So it was built in 940 and it's destroyed in 586, and now there's no Jerusalem and there's no temple. The people of God are exiled. Tens of thousands are taken to Babylon over on the other side of the Fertile Crescent, way, way over there. And what are they going to do about worship? What are they? Well, they don't. There is no temple. The priesthood, the Levites, are scattered too. There is no Ark of the Covenant. There is no altar of incense. What are we going to do? And there are a few psalms that express the grief and the longing of the children of Israel for Jerusalem and for the temple. And they talk about hanging their harps in the willow trees by the canals of Babylon. And the Babylonians are kind of mocking them and laughing at them, saying, hey, sing us a song out of your homeland. Sing us one of your Jewish songs. And the Jews say, how can we sing about a temple that has been destroyed? How can we sing about a city that was so beautiful and you guys knocked it down? And so there's grief and anguish on the part of the Jews for all of these years. So from the Babylonian exile, 586, to the time of Christ, Esther, Nehemiah, Ezra, Daniel, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, as well as pieces of the historical books would fit into this category. The Babylonian Empire is overtaken by the Persians. And in 330 BC, Alexander the Great begins his conquest of the Middle Eastern world. On Alexander's death, what he had conquered from the Mediterranean to India gets divided up into portions. And there are actually 4 parts for our purposes, 3 parts that got divided up among kings. And the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, Egypt and Syria, have an ongoing rivalry that results in battles and wars lasting decades. And Israel's right in the middle of this. There's a lot more, but what you should know is in Israel, the Seleucid dynasty tried to impose pagan forms of worship and pagan ideas on the people who were there, the people who had returned, come back from Babylon. And the Jews hated it. It was horrible. You know, the last thing that could be born was a Seleucid king demanded that the high priest, his name was Simon, offer a pig on the altar of the temple. The temple had been rebuilt. Offer a pig. Now, you know about kosher law, right? Unclean animals. Jews can't do that. A pig is a horrible, horrible thing to a Jew, incidentally to Arabs too. And so this order resulted in a battle, and the Jews formed a guerrilla band, and they actually kicked the Seleucids out. They got their independence for a short period of time. Sadly, the ruling family, called the Hasmoneans, eventually devolved into fighting each other, as often happens. And towards the end of this period of time, in about 67 AD, one part of the family talked to some foreign mercenaries and said, if we hire you to fight against our enemies, the other parts of the clan, would you do that? And the foreign mercenaries said, sure, we'll do that for you. Guess who they were? The Romans, as in the Roman Empire. And so they came and they fought, and then they stayed from 67 BC. So from that point on, the Romans are now running Israel. Kim?
Where did the Romans come from? Like, where did they go and talk to them?
I think Josephus has a lot of material on that, and I don't remember where they made contact. There were overtures with other people groups between the Hasmoneans and these other mercenary groups and so on. I don't remember the backstory of where they came from. But yeah, they were already flexing their muscles in the Mediterranean, and the Hasmonean dynasty that was in charge said, well, these guys look like good fighters, but they didn't realize you invite the Romans in, and they'll come, but they will never leave. And that's where we're into almost the New Testament period at this point. Babylonian and Persian. So the Babylonian is on top, the green, does that show up as green? So here's Babylonia, this whole territory. Notice that Babylon never really did get to Egypt. Egypt was able to hold out against Nebuchadnezzar. But the Persians, they took over everything. This whole territory is the Persian Empire, world's largest empire up to that point, until Alexander the Great. So, talking now about the return to Israel. So in 538, one of the great Persian kings, Cyrus the Great, he issues an edict, and he did this for other peoples too, but he did it for the Jews. He says, I want for you to go home and rebuild your city and rebuild your temple. I give you permission, and I'm going to give you a chunk of money, and you can do that. So this foreign policy, this idea, is very different from the Assyrians, and it's very different from the Babylonians. They had their own ideas about how do you keep control over dozens of different nations and people groups and languages. The Persians are going to be more diplomatic. They're going to be more conciliatory. And so Cyrus says, go home and rebuild with my blessing. And don't forget, when you've got your nice new temple, to pray for me too. And so he sends a group back. Zerubbabel and Joshua lead the initial contingent of Jews back to Jerusalem in 535 BC. And the temple in Jerusalem was rebuilt over a period of time from 535 to about 516. And there are books of the Bible that talk about the rebuilding of the temple specifically. There's one prophet that God sent to this small group of Jews living in Jerusalem, and he challenged them because they had gotten discouraged, they put their tools down, and they were not working on the temple. Instead, they were working on their own houses. And this prophet said, is it time for you to live in paneled houses when my house lies desolate? How come it is that you work hard in the field, You put your money in your pocket, and it's like your pocket has a hold on it. By the time you get home, your money's all gone. Have you wondered why that is? Anybody know the name of this prophet? Kim does.
No, I don't.
Okay.
Is it Micah?
No, Haggai. Haggai is the prophet who was sent to the returnees in a period of time when they had stopped work on the temple. There's political pressure, there's financial pressure, there's stuff going on, but they allowed themselves to get discouraged, and Haggai says, you need to get going. You need to get back in there and work. And so they do. They rebuild it. When that was being worked on, the old people wept when they laid the cornerstone for the new temple. And there's some debate about why they wept. One option is they wept for joy because we're starting to rebuild. There's another option. Anybody know what it is? They were little children when they remembered the first temple, the Temple of Solomon. Gold embellishments and marble and granite and carvings, and this fabulous building that was dedicated to the glory of God. And now what these poor people are building is a very poor replica of that first temple. So there's more returns led by Ezra in 458 and by Nehemiah. Nehemiah works hard on rebuilding the walls for physical security around the city. In the intertestamental period, several things have happened. I mentioned a moment ago that the Jews in Babylon and elsewhere didn't have a temple to go to. They couldn't worship as they had been instructed to worship in the Old Testament. And what began to happen was there were men who began to study the Torah, the Pentateuch, the law, and those people, the people around them, began to look up to these people as teachers. You have the beginnings of the rabbis, the beginnings of teachers of the law. And along the way, it developed into groups, into sects or divisions of experts. One would be the Pharisees. So the Pharisees were very, very legalistic. They demanded you do it this way, and they added, if there's one law that says, do not do any normal work on the Sabbath, they added 55 more sub-laws saying, well, if you drop a stick, you can pick up one stick, but if you try to pick up another stick, you're violating the law. That kind of thing. Picayune, legalistic, of their own manufacture. So the Pharisees, now they did take the Bible seriously. The Pharisees did. They believed that there is a resurrection. They believed that there is a spiritual life. They believed in angels. Another group of experts, the Sadducees, they took the Bible more symbolically. And they said, well, there is no resurrection. There's no physical resurrection. There are no angels. And any sort of spiritual life, we're mostly materialistic. The Sadducees, when they got back in the land, in these returns, they began to consolidate their power because they were related to the Levites. And the Sadducees consolidated their power in and around Jerusalem, and the high priest family, they were Sadducees. So the power base of the Sadducees is in and around Jerusalem, whereas the Pharisees were more spread out in the countryside. Another thing that developed in the intertestamental period, and it's a little fuzzy exactly how and when this evolved, because there's no temple to go and worship at, people in exile began to think, well, can we do something? Is there a right way to worship God while we're not in Jerusalem? And again, it's fuzzy how this evolved, but the beginnings of the synagogue. So this is kind of like the Sunday school of the ancient Jews. And every town had, you had to have a minyan. A minyan is a minimum of 10 men, 10 Jewish men. If you have 9, no, you don't meet it. We actually have records of this in Paul's travels when he went to a new town, the first place he always went was the synagogue. There's one place he went, there was no synagogue apparently, Philippi. And so he went down to the river where there were some women who were praying. So the synagogue evolved in this intertestamental period as well. There are 3 territories of Israel, and the middle one is quasi-Israeli. The southern part is Judea, the northern part is Galilee, and in between is Samaria. The people of Samaria were a mixture of Jews who were left after the Assyrian and Babylonian captivities, and Gentile peoples who were moved in by the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and they intermarried. So the Jews said about the Samaritans, they're not really Jews. They're kind of half-breed. There's great bigotry and prejudice against the Samaritans. The Samaritans felt similarly about the Jews. So the Samaritans worship at Mount Gerizim. They had and still have their own Torah. They actually only believe in the first 5 books of the Old Testament. They do not believe in the rest of the Old Testament. So there's a lot of animosity between the Samaritans and the Jews. So when Jesus says to his disciples, I must go through Samaria, the disciples were shocked. Nobody does that. Well, I'll show you a map here momentarily, what people did instead. So here is a map of the area. Here's Judea down here, centered around Jerusalem, right there. So this is Judea. Here's Galilee, and in between is Samaria. And 90% of Jews who had to travel between Judah and Galilee would do this. They would cross the Jordan River into Perea, go up here, and cross back over. So you didn't have to go through Samaria. That's how bad the tension was. And Jesus ministered, John chapter 4, quite a bit in Samaria, at least on his first trip. Later on, we find out that Jesus was going to go to Jerusalem for his last trip. And he did go through Samaria, but the people that time didn't really accept him, because it says he had his face set towards Jerusalem. In other words, it was obvious he's on a mission, he's traveling fast, he's not here to stick around. So those are the 3 regions of Israel. So in the first century AD, Roman occupation government apparatus in Israel, the Roman Empire occupied Israel, 63 BC. There were Roman garrisons and government officials throughout the territory. So every major city had a Roman military presence, and in hot spots there would be Roman soldiers there as well. Jews resented the Roman presence among them. They didn't like it at all. There were numerous rebellions and uprisings, riots and so on, assassinations of Roman officers and government officials. Tax collectors and other Jews who worked for the Romans or cooperated with them were seen as collaborators or traitors. So the Lord Jesus actually called a tax collector to be one of his disciples. Who was that? Matthew. Another one of Jesus' disciples is Simon the Zealot. The Zealots were ultranationalists. One group of the Zealots were called the Sicarii. They were an underground guerrilla movement that carried out political assassinations with daggers. Now, we don't know if Simon was a Sicarii or not, but he was a zealot. And a zealot would have been just as likely to punch a tax collector in the face as he would have been to even look at him. And probably the tax collectors weren't that fond of zealots either. How did they get along? How could they sit at the same table and break bread together? Only Jesus. Only Jesus could make that happen. Some Jews were part of the Herodians, so this is another class. So you've got Pharisees and Sadducees. Those are quasi-religious political groups. And the Herodians are people who are largely rich and of the upper echelons of society, and they kind of liked what the Romans were doing. So they have fine art and architecture, and they're moving in higher society circles and so on. And the Herodians were largely in favor of Hellenistic culture, what the Romans had brought in. In the first century, the focal point of the New Testament starts in Jerusalem, Judea, Galilee, a little bit in Samaria, so that's the Gospels. And then in the first chapters of the book of Acts, it's in Jerusalem, what's happening there. But then, starting about chapter 10 or so, it moves up north towards Joppa. And then in chapter 11, 12, 13, it's moving even farther up to Antioch, Syrian Antioch, which is on the coast. And from there, the next thing that we know, in chapter 13, the Holy Spirit says to the church of Antioch, "Set apart for me Paul and Barnabas for the work to which I've called them." And now the church of Antioch is going to send out the first missionaries of the church age, and they're going to go into Asia Minor. What's Asia Minor today? What nation occupies Asia Minor? Turkey. And eventually, they're going to go to Philippi, which is Greece, and you can make a very cogent case that that is Europe. The gospel is going to get into Europe. So this is the Roman Empire in the first century. So the gospel starts here, and then it moves north up in here, and then it moves to Antioch, and out of Antioch it goes all over here. We're out of time. We'll work more on Bible backgrounds next week, Lord willing. Do you have any questions very quickly before we shut down? Carl.
The Jews not go to this area because they tested their word, because they feared for their city, because they were like actually so they went around.
Mostly number one, but number two could be a piece of it too. Mostly they just hated each other, but there could have been occasions of violence too. Any other questions?
Pastor, traveling, how many miles did they just travel?
I should have had a legend on there. From Jerusalem to Nazareth is 40 miles. It's not a huge country. It's not gigantic. I'll try to get some numbers next time. Okay, let's close in prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you for the Word of God. Thank you that it is real. The events recorded in it are history. Thank you that your love for us is also real. We ask your blessing upon the morning service, that Jesus Christ would be exalted and that we would be edified in the faith. We give you thanks in Jesus' name. Amen.